Oxfordshire, 1842. The iron gates of Clintwood Manor were never meant to swing open for someone like Martha Thomas. For 23 years, Martha had been a ghost haunting the frost-bitten alleys of London, a woman who had learned that survival was a silent, ugly business. She stood in the freezing slush, her fingers numbed to the bone, clutching a tattered shawl that offered no warmth against the biting wind. She was there to beg, to plead for a single crust of bread from the aristocratic giant who ruled the estate. She did not know that she was standing on her own soil. She did not know that the blood running through her shivering veins was the same blue blood that built the towering stone walls before her. Inside the manor, Timothy Dalton, the Duke of Clintwood, stood by the hearth, the weight of a 20-year-old failure pressing against his chest. For 23 years, he had spent a fortune chasing shadows, scouring every corner of the continent for the infant sister who had been snatched from her cradle during a night of fire and blood. He had looked in palaces, he had looked in cathedrals, he had never looked at the beggars at his own gate. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable restlessness, Timothy stepped out into the cold, his gaze landing on the trembling woman. He intended to offer a coin and turn away, but as Martha lifted her head, the gray winter light hit her face. The Duke froze. There, pinned to her rags, was a rusted silver locket, the twin to the one he carried in his vest. Before we go further, please take a second to subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The silence that followed was louder than a cannon blast. In that heartbeat, the world shifted. The search was over. The beggar was a lady, and the Duke realized that while he had been searching the world for his sister, she had been dying slowly in the shadow of his own home. Timothy's hand trembled as he reached forward, his gloved fingers hovering inches from the tarnished locket that hung against Martha's collarbone. She flinched, instinct telling her that when the rich reached for you, it was never gentle. But the Duke's face had gone white as parchment, and his voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Where did you get that?" Martha's throat tightened. She had been asked that question 1,000 times by pawnbrokers and thieves, all eager to strip her of the one thing she owned that might have value. Her answer was always the same. "It's mine. Always has been." "Open it," Timothy commanded, though his tone carried no arrogance, only a desperate hope that made him sound younger than his 40 years. With numb fingers, Martha pried open the locket. Inside was a faded miniature portrait, a woman with kind eyes and a man with Timothy's exact jawline. Beneath it, engraved in script so small it had survived decades of grime, were two names, Eleanor and Charles Dalton. Timothy staggered backward, pulling his own locket from his vest. He opened it with shaking hands to reveal the identical portrait, the identical names. The two lockets had been commissioned as a pair, one for each child on the night of their christening. His had been kept in a locked drawer. Hers had been stolen along with the infant who wore it. "What is your birth date?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I don't know," Martha said honestly. "The woman who raised me, if you can call it that, said I was found in the winter of 1819. She guessed I was no more than a few months old." December 1819, the month his sister had been taken, the month the house had burned, the month their parents had died trying to save the children from the flames, only managing to rescue Timothy before the nursery wing collapsed. "Your name," Timothy breathed.
They told me the kidnappers would have changed it. What did they call you?" "Martha. Martha Thomas. But I don't think Thomas was ever real. The woman who had me sold me to a factory when I was 7, said I wasn't worth the bread I ate." Timothy's composure shattered. He dropped to his knees in the slush, eye level with the woman who had learned to make herself small to survive. "You are Amelia Rose Dalton," he said, his voice thick with 2 decades of grief. "You are my sister. You are the lady of the North Wing, and you are home." Martha did not cry. She had forgotten how. But something in her chest cracked open, and for the first time in 23 years, she allowed herself to hope that the world might not be entirely made of cold iron and closed doors.
The transformation began the moment Martha crossed the threshold of Clintwood Manor. Servants appeared like apparitions, their faces carefully neutral as they escorted the shivering woman through halls lined with portraits of people whose blood she apparently shared. Timothy walked beside her, his hand hovering near her elbow as though afraid she might vanish if he looked away. They brought her to a chamber that had been preserved like a shrine. The walls were painted the soft blue of a summer sky, and toys sat gathering dust on shelves: a rocking horse, a porcelain doll with painted eyes, a christening gown encased in glass. This had been the nursery before the fire, relocated and restored as a monument to a child Timothy had refused to bury without a body. "I kept it for you," he said simply. "I always believed you would come home." Martha stood in the center of the room, her filthy boots leaving marks on the oriental rug, and felt like an intruder. This room had been built for an infant aristocrat, a girl who would have grown up with tutors and silk dresses and the certainty that the world was hers to inherit. Martha Thomas had grown up with lice and hunger, and the knowledge that the world would sooner crush her than acknowledge she existed. "I don't belong here," she whispered. "You belong here more than anyone," Timothy countered. "This is your birthright, Amelia." "Don't call me that." The words came out sharper than she intended. "That girl died in the fire. I'm Martha. I've always been Martha." Timothy's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then we will call you Martha, but you will still be Lady Martha Dalton, whether you feel like her or not." The servants drew her a bath, the first hot bath of her entire life. They scrubbed away layers of soot and dirt until her skin was raw and pink, revealing a complexion that had been hidden beneath years of London grime. They dressed her in a gown of emerald silk that made her look like a stranger in the mirror. Her hair, once a matted tangle, was washed and pinned with combs that cost more than she had earned in her entire life. Before we go further, please take a second to subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. When she descended the stairs for dinner that evening, Timothy stood at the base, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he simply stared. "You look exactly like Mother," he finally said, and his voice broke on the last word. Martha gripped the banister, her knuckles white. The gown was beautiful, the house was magnificent, but she felt like a fraud dressed in someone else's stolen life. And the silk against her skin felt less like luxury and more like a very expensive straitjacket. The education of Lady Martha Dalton began at dawn and did not end until long after the candles burned low. Timothy hired the finest tutors in Oxfordshire, stern-faced men and women who taught her how to hold a teacup,
how to curtsy without losing her balance, how to make small talk that meant nothing and everything at once. But Martha had survived 23 years on the streets by reading people, and she read her brother like an open book. Beneath his patient instruction and gentle corrections, she saw the desperation. He was trying to erase Martha Thomas and resurrect Amelia Rose, and every lesson felt like a small death. "You're holding the fork wrong," Timothy said, for the third time during dinner. Martha set down the utensil with deliberate care. "In the factory, we didn't have forks. We had our hands, and if you were lucky, a piece of tin that could cut bread or throats, depending on the day." Timothy's face paled. "Martha!" Martha interrupted, her voice steady. "You want to teach me how to be a lady? Then let me teach you what it means to be invisible. Let me teach you about the real London, the one you've never seen from your carriage." She told him about the children who slept in doorways and the women who sold their bodies because starvation was worse than shame. She told him about the factory foreman who took his wages in flesh and the constables who looked the other way because poor girls weren't worth the paperwork.
She told him about the night she had watched a boy no older than 10 freeze to death in an alley while the gentry walked past in their furs, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, their eyes sliding over the body as though it were no more significant than a pile of rubbish. If you can't stand people who ignore suffering just because it's inconvenient to acknowledge, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type, "Nobody deserves that." Because what happened next only got worse. Timothy listened, his meal forgotten, his hands clenched into fists on the table. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "I didn't know," he finally said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You didn't want to know," Martha corrected, not unkindly. "None of you do. It's easier to throw coins at the problem and pretend you've done something noble." "Then teach me," Timothy said, his voice fierce. "Teach me how to see what I've been blind to, and I will teach you how to survive in a world that will try to destroy you the moment you show weakness." It was the first honest conversation they had since the gates, and it marked the beginning of something neither of them expected. Not just a sibling relationship, but a partnership built on mutual respect rather than obligation. The extended Dalton family arrived like a murder of crows descending on fresh carrion. They came in gilded carriages, dressed in their finest, their smiles sharp enough to draw blood. At the center of the flock was Cornelius Dalton, Timothy's cousin, and the man who had stood to inherit the duchy if no direct heir was ever found. Cornelius was a man of 45, with a face like a pampered hound and eyes that calculated the value of everything they touched. He had spent 23 years counting down the days until Timothy died without an heir, and now this beggar girl had appeared from nowhere to snatch his birthright away. "So, this is the prodigal sister," Cornelius said, circling Martha like she was livestock at market. "Forgive me, Timothy, but are we quite certain any desperate woman could have stolen that locket?" "The locket was never reported stolen," Timothy said coldly, "and Martha knows things, details about the night of the fire that were never made public." "Details she could have learned from any servant with loose lips and a thirst for gin," Cornelius countered. His wife, Beatrice, stood at his elbow, her mouth pursed in permanent disapproval. Their daughter, Penelope, watched Martha with barely concealed contempt. "We should have a physician examine her. Surely there must be some family resemblance, some mark that proves her claim." "There is," Timothy said,
his voice like steel. "She has a birthmark on her left shoulder blade, a mark shaped like a crescent moon. It's documented in the family records from her christening." Martha felt the weight of their stares like hands around her throat. She had spent her entire life being invisible, and now she was the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. These people didn't want to welcome her home. They wanted to prove she was a liar so they could throw her back into the gutter where she belonged. "Show them," Timothy said, softly, his eyes apologetic. Martha's hands trembled as she turned and lowered the shoulder of her gown, revealing the pale crescent mark that had been with her since birth. It was small, barely the size of a shilling, but it was unmistakable. The room fell silent. Cornelius's face turned the color of spoiled meat. He had been counting on doubt, on the possibility that this woman was a clever fraud. But the birthmark was irrefutable proof, documented and witnessed by the family physician who had delivered Amelia Rose Dalton 23 years ago. "Well," said Cornelius, his voice dripping venom, "it seems we have a lady among us. How unfortunate that she spent all those years learning the manners of the gutter rather than the drawing room. One wonders if such a creature can ever truly be civilized." Martha lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with the cold stare she had perfected in the slums. "I may have learned my manners in the gutter, Lord Cornelius, but I at least learned them honestly. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth, but I wasn't born with a forked tongue either." Penelope gasped, Beatrice looked faint, and Timothy smiled. The war had begun.
Martha couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft, the silence too loud, and the darkness of Clintwood Manor was nothing like the darkness she had known in London. There, the darkness was alive with danger, footsteps in the alleys, the cry of a hungry child, the crash of breaking glass. Here, the darkness was heavy and expectant, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She rose and wandered the corridors in her nightgown, a candle trembling in her hand. The portraits watched her pass, generations of Daltons with their proud faces and expensive clothes. She searched their painted features for some trace of herself, but found only strangers. Her feet carried her, unbidden, to the old nursery wing. The door was unlocked, though it creaked like an old man's bones as she pushed it open. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, illuminating a space that had been rebuilt after the fire, but never truly restored. The walls were newer than the rest of the house, the paint not quite matched, the floorboards still carrying the faint scent of char beneath layers of varnish. Martha moved through the room as though in a dream. Her fingers traced the edge of a child's bed, the keys of a tiny pianoforte, the spines of books meant for bedtime stories. And then she saw it, a burn mark on the eastern wall, shaped like reaching fingers. It had been painted over, plastered over, but it bled through like a scar that refused to heal. She pressed her palm against it, and something shifted in her mind, not quite memory, but the ghost of one. She smelled smoke.
She heard screaming. She felt strong arms lifting her, wrapping her in cloth, carrying her through heat and chaos, and then nothing. Blackness, the severing of one life and the brutal beginning of another. "You remember." Martha spun, heart hammering. Timothy stood in the doorway, his own candle casting long shadows across his face. "I don't remember," Martha said. "Not really, just pieces, feelings." Timothy entered the room, moving carefully, as though afraid his weight might shatter whatever fragile thing hung in the air between them. "I remember everything," he said. "I was 5 years old, old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, not old enough to stop it." He gestured to the burn mark. "Father got me out first. He told me to run to the servants' quarters and not look back, but I did. I looked back. I saw him go back inside for you and Mother. I saw the nursery roof collapse, and I saw—" His voice broke. "I saw someone in the garden, a figure, carrying a bundle, running toward the back gate." "The kidnapper," Martha whispered. "That," Timothy said grimly, "is what we're going to find out." The Clintwood archives were kept in a locked room in the lowest level of the manor, where the air smelled of old paper and older secrets. Timothy had inherited the duchy at age 18 when their uncle, their father's brother, had died of a sudden illness. He had also inherited boxes upon boxes of documents, ledgers, letters, legal papers spanning generations. "I went through these once," Timothy said, setting his candle on a dusty table, "when I first took up the search for you. But I was looking for leads about where you might have been taken, orphanages, workhouses, reports of abandoned children. I wasn't looking for betrayal from inside the family." But now, with fresh eyes and darker suspicions, they began again. They read through correspondence from the weeks before the fire, through financial records, through testimonies given to constables, and slowly, horribly, a picture began to emerge. Their uncle, Reginald Dalton, had been drowning in gambling debts in 1819. He had borrowed heavily from moneylenders, using his expected inheritance as collateral. But with 2 healthy children ahead of him in the line of succession, that inheritance was looking more and more like a fantasy. Martha found the first damning letter buried in a stack of mundane household accounts. It was addressed to Reginald from a man named Jeremiah Hook, a name that meant nothing to her, but made Timothy go rigid. Hook was a fence, a criminal who dealt in stolen goods and worse. He was hanged for murder in 1825. The letter was brief and brutally clear. "The matter you proposed can be arranged. The child will disappear, and questions will be answered with ashes. Your debt will be forgiven in exchange for the agreed sum once you inherit. If you believe families should protect each other, not destroy each other for money, hit that subscribe button. People like Reginald won't, and you need to hear what he did about it." Martha's hands shook as she read the words again. "He paid someone to kidnap me. He set the fire to cover it up. He murdered your parents, our parents, for money. And he almost got away with it," Timothy said, his voice hollow. "When he died 6 years later, I thought it was justice, divine retribution for a man who had always been weak and cruel. But I never knew the depths of his cruelty. I never knew he was the architect of everything we lost." They found more letters, more evidence. Reginald had paid Hook to take the infant Amelia and dispose of her, preferably fatally, though Hook had apparently decided that selling a healthy baby to a woman who wanted a child to exploit was more profitable than simple murder. The fire had been set deliberately, timed to look like an accident with the nursery hearth. Charles and Eleanor Dalton had died trying to save their children from a tragedy that was engineered by family. Martha stared at the papers spread across the table, the proof that her entire life had been a transaction, that she had been stolen and sold and erased because she was worth more dead than alive, to a man who shared her blood. "He's already dead," she said flatly. "We can't make him pay." "No," Timothy agreed.
But his son can. Martha looked up sharply. Cornelius? Cornelius was 19 when the fire happened, old enough to know what his father was planning, perhaps even old enough to help. Timothy's face was carved from ice. And he has spent 23 years waiting for me to die so he could claim what he thinks is rightfully his.
Confronting Cornelius required proof, and proof required a confession. Timothy and Martha spent a week preparing, gathering every document, every letter, every scrap of evidence that pointed to Reginald's guilt. And then they baited the trap. Timothy announced that he was hosting a grand ball at Clintwood Manor to officially introduce Lady Martha Dalton to society. Every prominent family in Oxfordshire would attend, including the extended Dalton relatives. It would be Martha's debut as the rightful lady of the North Wing, and it would be Cornelius's public humiliation if they played their cards correctly. The night before the ball, Martha stood in her chambers and stared at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. Hair styled in elaborate curls, face powdered and painted, body corseted into a gown of midnight blue silk that made her look like she had been born to wear it. But beneath the finery, she was still the girl who slept in doorways and stolen bread to survive. Timothy found her there, her hands gripping the edge of the vanity hard enough to turn her knuckles white. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "If you want to walk away, if you want to take your share of the inheritance and disappear, I will not stop you." Martha turned to face him. "Is that what you want? For me to disappear again?" "No." The word came out fierce and immediate. "I want you to stay. I want you to take your place as my sister and as a lady of this house, but I will not trap you here. You have spent your entire life with no choices. I will not take your choice away now." Martha looked at her brother, this man who had spent 23 years searching for a ghost, who had kept a nursery like a shrine, who had recognized her at his gates when the rest of the world looked through her like she was invisible. She had spent so long afraid that his love was pity, that his generosity was guilt. But she saw now that it was neither. It was simply love, uncomplicated and unconditional, the kind she had never known existed. "I'm not running, not from him, not from this. I have been invisible my entire life, and I am done hiding." Timothy smiled, a real smile, fierce. "Then let's burn his world down." The ballroom of Clintwood Manor glittered like a jewelry box brought to life. Hundreds of candles cast golden light across the polished floor, reflected in mirrors and crystal, until the room seemed to glow from within. The guests arrived in waves, lords and ladies, politicians and merchants, all dressed in their finest, all hungry for scandal and spectacle. Cornelius arrived with his family, his smile fixed and poisonous. He had spent the last week spreading whispers about Martha, about her coarse manners, her dubious origins, her unsuitability for the role Timothy was forcing upon her. He expected tonight to be her downfall, the moment when the veneer cracked and the beggar girl beneath was exposed for all to see. He did not expect what actually happened. Timothy opened the evening with a speech, introducing Martha not as a lost child returned, but as a woman who survived impossible odds and emerged stronger for it. He spoke of her resilience, her intelligence, her refusal to be broken by a world that had tried to crush her. And then he invited her to speak. Martha rose, her heart a drum against her ribs, and walked to the center of the ballroom. Every eye was on her, judging, measuring, waiting for her to fail. She thought of the factory floors where she had bled. She thought of the alleys where she had frozen. She thought of the gates where she had begged.
and she lifted her chin. "I am Martha Dalton," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "I was stolen as an infant, sold as a child, and forgotten as a woman. For 23 years I have been invisible to people like you, people who walk past suffering because it is easier than acknowledging it exists." She pulled the letters from her bodice, Reginald's letters, Hook's letters, the documented proof of the conspiracy that destroyed her life. "I was taken from this house by my own uncle, a man who valued money more than family. He set the fire that killed our parents.
He paid a criminal to dispose of me, and he spent the rest of his life enjoying the inheritance he earned with blood." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Cornelius surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is slander! Those documents are forgeries! She's trying to—" "Trying to what?" Martha interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "Trying to destroy your father's memory? Your father destroyed himself, Lord Cornelius. These letters are signed in his hand, sealed with his ring, and unless you can prove they are false, you will sit down and you will listen." Cornelius sat, though his hands trembled with fury. Martha continued reading from the letters, exposing every detail of the conspiracy. She detailed how Hook had sold her to a woman who worked children to death in factories. She described the years of hunger and abuse, the casual cruelty of a world that saw her as disposable. And she ended with a question that echoed through the ballroom like a bell. How many other children have been forgotten? How many others are standing at your gates right now, invisible because you choose not to see them? The silence that followed was profound. Martha had not just exposed Cornelius, she had exposed every person in that room who had ever looked away from suffering. She had held up a mirror, and they did not like what they saw. Timothy rose and stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Martha Dalton is my sister. She is the rightful lady of the North Wing, and anyone who questions her place in this family will answer to me." Cornelius left the ball in disgrace, his wife and daughter hurrying behind him. The social ruin Martha had feared for herself had landed squarely on his shoulders, and she felt no pity. He knew what his father did. He kept the secret, hoping it would profit him one day. Now he would pay the price. The weeks after the ball were a strange, quiet time. The scandal rocked Oxfordshire society, and Cornelius withdrew to his estate, stripped of his social standing and the inheritance he had coveted. Investigations were launched into Reginald's other dealings, revealing a web of debts, bribes, and petty cruelties that stained the Dalton name further. But inside Clintwood Manor, something gentler was happening. Martha and Timothy were learning to be siblings, not the fairy tale reunion they might have had in another life, but something real and messy and true. They argued about money and politics and the proper way to pour tea. They laughed at private jokes and shared silences that were comfortable rather than tense. Martha used her share of the inheritance to do what she had promised herself in the cold nights when she had nothing. She built a school for children who had been forgotten, orphans, factory workers, street children who had learned to survive by tooth and nail. She hired teachers who had been poor themselves, who understood that education was not about manners and curtsies, but about giving someone the tools to fight for a better life. Timothy joined her in the work, learning to see the London she had survived. Together, they became advocates for the forgotten, pushing for reforms in child labor laws, funding shelters,
demanding that the invisible be seen. On a cold morning in December, exactly 1 year after Martha had stood shivering at the gates, she returned to that spot. The iron gates were open now, as they always were. She had given orders that they were never to be locked again, that anyone who needed help would find it at Clintwood Manor.
Timothy found her there, her breath forming clouds in the winter air, her eyes distant. "Do you regret it?" he asked, "coming inside that day?" Martha turned to him, and for the first time since he had found her, she smiled, a real smile, not guarded or uncertain, but free. "No," she said, "I thought this was a cage, but it's a weapon, and I'm going to use it to make sure no one else is left begging at the gates." Timothy took her hand, and together they walked back to the manor. The house that had been a monument to loss had become something else. A home earned not through blood or birthright, but through the choice to fight for what was right. Martha Dalton, born Amelia Rose, forged in the fires of London's cruelest streets, had found her crown. But more than that, she had found her purpose. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer forgotten. She was exactly where she belonged. If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you are watching this from. Represent your country. The gates of Clintwood Manor would never close again, and neither would Martha's heart. She had spent 23 years learning to survive. Now she would spend the rest of her life teaching others how to live.